Among the more prosperous English monasteries, the first decades of Tudor rule do not seem to have brought immediate decline. In many of these houses, the number of monks and canons remained fairly steady. Income continued to support the community, and younger members with ability were still being sent to the universities for further study. This atmosphere of stability, and in some places real strength, allowed certain monasteries to support ambitious intellectual and artistic work. One striking development was their growing commitment to enriching worship through an advanced new kind of polyphonic music. Many houses came to see the value of bringing highly trained singers into the liturgy so that complex, newly composed music could be heard within the daily rhythm of devotion. The greatest foundations moved first. From around 1480 they expanded older and much smaller musical arrangements that had existed for generations and turned them into something far more impressive. Their example was soon followed by other monasteries, not only the richest and most famous, but also middling and even relatively small communities. The beauty and magnificence of worship, especially on great feast days and in services dedicated to the Virgin Mary, became something these religious houses deliberately cultivated with pride. This was not a movement originally created by monks themselves. The impulse had first come from the musical world of the secular church, where professional church musicians had already begun shaping a more brilliant and demanding style of liturgical performance. Monastic communities adapted those developments to their own needs, often relying on experienced lay professionals to help establish and sustain the new musical standards. By the 1530s, this effort had produced a deeply rooted culture of liturgical music. In smaller and middling houses, the adoption of this repertory showed a clear desire to match the best current practice elsewhere in English worship. In the most ambitious monasteries, the result was impressive enough to place them close to the leading secular churches of the realm. Their achievement was recognized even at the level of government. When the larger monasteries were dissolved and some were converted into secular cathedrals, the authorities specifically ordered that the polyphonic singers, boys and men alike, should remain in place and form the heart of the new choirs. Across all the changes and crises that monastic life experienced in England from the 10th century to the 16th, one principle remained central. Divine worship stood above everything else. For monks and for many lay people around them, the unceasing cycle of prayer and sacrifice carried on by day and night, through Mass and office, was the highest duty that could be offered to God. It glorified Him, sanctified those who served Him, and helped preserve a sense that divine grace still continued to flow into the world. In that setting, music was never a mere decoration. It was part of the effort to give worship the dignity and intensity thought fitting for the service of heaven. During the later 15th century, English church music entered one of its most remarkable periods. A new and highly elaborate style of polyphony emerged, written for choirs of boys and men and intended to heighten the solemnity and splendor of the liturgy. Before this, most church polyphony had usually been written for just 3 or 4 adult male voices and stayed within a limited range. Around the early 1450s, composers began to widen that sound. They introduced boys' treble voices and deeper adult bass parts. And they wrote music not simply for a few specialist soloists, but for broader choral forces. This expanded the musical range to 3 octaves and created the full 5-part texture of treble, alto, 2 tenors, and bass. Out of this came the sound that later generations would recognize as one of the defining features of English cathedral music. Traditional polyphony for men's voices alone did not disappear, but by the early 1470s the newer style had become standard in the great cathedrals, collegiate churches, and elite chapels where it had first been developed. This music was very different from plainsong, the single melodic line that had shaped the whole liturgical life of the church for centuries. and which every properly trained monk had to learn in detail during his formation. The new polyphony demanded far more. It belonged to the world of major composers whose skill shaped the finest sacred music of the age. Its purpose was clear. It gave greater distinction to feast days than to ordinary days, and greater emphasis to the most important devotions. Sung without instruments supporting the voices, it required extraordinary control, endurance, and refinement from those who performed it. A single votive antiphon could stretch for many minutes and demand sustained passages of difficult ornamentation. A mass setting could continue for half an hour or more. A Magnificat might last nearly 10 minutes. This was music for trained specialists, not for casual or amateur use. Anyone who sang it needed not only a strong and beautiful voice, but also disciplined instruction in technique and in reading the written notation of the day. From around 1480 onward, some of the more energetic monasteries committed themselves seriously to bringing this kind of music into their own worship. By the 1530s, they had achieved far more than might once have seemed possible, and the practice had spread surprisingly widely. The singers who performed it were usually laymen and boys rather than monks alone. But that does not suggest indifference on the part of monastic communities. The nature of monastic life itself made it impossible for them to provide every necessary resource internally. The most obvious obstacle was the treble line, which required boys with unbroken voices. Monasteries could not produce such singers from among professed monks, since profession took place only at an age beyond childhood. Beyond that, the musical skills needed for this repertory had become highly specialized. Composition, direction, vocal training, and performance at this level were crafts of real difficulty. Monks could contribute where they were able, and some became highly accomplished. But for what they could not provide themselves, they sensibly turned to outside expertise. The first monasteries to move decisively in this direction were often those that already possessed some form of smaller musical establishment. In certain places there was already a lady chapel choir made up of secular singers, originally founded in the late 14th or early 15th century to enhance the daily Mass of the Virgin. That daily Lady Mass, usually celebrated apart from the main monastic choir, had long been an important devotional feature. A select group of monks sang its plainsong, while extra lay singers were added to enrich the service. In some abbeys, these lay musicians were a few part-time adult singers who performed polyphony at Lady Mass, and sometimes also helped in the main church on the greatest feast days. Elsewhere, the arrangement was different. A single professional musician acted as instructor and drew several suitable boys from the monastery school, training them to sing at Lady Mass. At that stage, boys were not yet used in composed polyphony. They strengthened plainsong and often improvised simple counterpoint above it. Their role was limited to the lady chapel and did not yet extend into the monks' main choir. In houses where such a teacher already existed, his work could go beyond training boys. He might also coach musically gifted monks in more advanced practice, allowing a small group of religious and their instructor to sing polyphony together at selected points in the main liturgy. Fragments of this earlier repertory still survive from certain cathedrals, showing that some monks were already engaging with sophisticated music before the full flowering of the later style. These earlier arrangements, though modest, had been enough for the expectations of the time. What changed in the 1480s was the appearance of a new and much grander body of choral music, written for fuller forces. Its devotional power and ceremonial effect quickly became obvious, and many monastic leaders decided that it deserved a place in their own churches. To adopt this music, a monastery needed two things above all. First, it needed a capable director, a professional musician who could teach, train, supervise, and perform. Second, it needed an ensemble of boys and men able to carry the music. The contracts given to these musical directors reveal what monasteries expected from them. Their duties varied somewhat from place to place, but the general goal was consistent. The authorities wanted a choir made up of boys and men, all trained in polyphony. Where no earlier provision existed, everything had to be built from the ground up. Where a house already had adult singing men, it needed to add boys and a qualified instructor. Where it already had boys and a teacher, the existing arrangement had to be raised to a much higher standard. Boys, who had once been taught plain song and simple descant, now had to learn notated polyphony. Men's voices also had to be supplied, whether by hired professionals or by monks trained for the purpose. In the years between 1480 and the early 16th century, many of the better-run monasteries established exactly such choirs. Houses that already had adult singers were often first to act, since boys could be recruited from the almonry school attached to the monastery. At some places, an older group of men was enlarged by a new body of boys under a professional master. In others, where a cantor and boy choristers already existed, the first step was to appoint a more skilled musical director who could teach the boys not only plain song and improvised counterpoint, but also the demanding art of singing written polyphony. Once that had been done, the house possessed a director and a team of boys capable of tackling the new music. The next question was how to supply the lower voices. Wealthier monasteries sometimes hired 3 or 4 professional adult singers to join the director and boys. That was expensive, but it produced a complete and self-contained choir of lay singers, small in number but fully equipped. Other monasteries chose a cheaper route. They expected the musical director to train selected monks or canons from within the house, so that they could sing the adult parts. This option was far more common. It demanded less money and drew on the talents already present within the community. In such cases, the resulting choir consisted of the director, the boys, and a number of trained religious. Even long after the first wave of new foundations, choirs of this kind continued to appear almost until the very eve of dissolution. By the 1530s, more than 50 monasteries are known to have possessed the trained resources needed for polyphonic performance. This was not restricted to the richest Benedictine abbeys. It spread across houses of different sizes and traditions, including Cistercians and Augustinian canons. It was visible in many of the cathedral priories and in a wide range of large and middling monastic communities. The purpose of hiring these directors was plain. Their main task was to teach and maintain liturgical music at a high level. The contracts make that unmistakable. At monasteries where the authorities expected strong musical participation from their own brethren, some monks were specifically assigned to the director as pupils. They were taught the full range of church music then considered useful. Organ playing, the singing of notated polyphony, plain song, and the various methods of improvised counterpoint that remained important in performance. This could be an extensive daily responsibility. Teaching took place in repeated sessions morning and afternoon on ordinary weekdays. In some monasteries, those monks who wished to learn could come voluntarily. In others, the prior or another superior selected them. Sometimes, composition itself was also taught. Even when the documents do not spell this out, it is likely that such instruction was often given in practice wherever musical ambition existed. This constant training created generations of monks who were musically literate and in some cases highly skilled. Some were praised for their command of both plainchant and polyphony. Some copied music for liturgical use. A few even appear among the named composers of the period. Others became capable organists who could play when needed in choir. In larger monasteries with a long-established musical office, there could be a regular stream of monks sufficiently trained to handle the organ or join in complex vocal music. The presence of lay experts did not replace monastic participation. Instead, it often stimulated it. At the same time, the director was always expected to teach a group of boys. These groups were not usually large. In many cathedrals and abbeys, there were around 6 to 8 boys, though some houses had fewer and some occasionally more. All were to learn how to sing polyphony from written notation. At certain places, they were also taught plainsong, improvised counterpoint, and organ playing. Since organ music in this period often depended on the same principles as vocal improvisation, the training of a singer could naturally extend to the keyboard. Sometimes only 1 or 2 boys at a time were given special keyboard instruction, probably for practical reasons. In at least one place, boys were trained as organ players for a fixed period and then required to remain available for years afterward to serve the house when needed. Instruments for practice were even supplied in some cases. By contrast, the hired adult singing men were not normally listed among the director's pupils. They were assumed to be finished professionals who would learn their music as part of their craft. All of this teaching had a practical goal. The singers had to perform in church, and their duties followed the same broad liturgical pattern found in the major secular churches. Wherever they were present, they supported the plain song of the monks, but they were also expected to provide polyphony and organ music. Their work can be divided into 2 main types. One was regular and routine, usually carried out daily inside chapels. The other was more occasional but more spectacular, taking place on feast days in the main monastic choir. One of their most regular duties was the daily Lady Mass in the Lady Chapel. Here, the monks celebrating the Mass were joined by the musical group, which sang the ordinary in polyphony and often added related items proper to the service. In some monasteries, the full team of director, adult singers, and boys attended. In others, especially where no hired adult singers were kept, the service was led by the director and boys alone, sometimes using music, written in 3 parts for divided boys' voices and an adult line. The same was true of the daily evening antiphon to the Virgin, a separate devotion commonly held in the Lady Chapel. This was one of the most important regular occasions for elaborate music, and the attendance of the boys and director appears to have been nearly universal. In many houses, the adult voices also joined, whether these were lay singers or trained monks. Many monasteries also extended this musical provision to the weekly devotions in honour of the holy name of Jesus. On Fridays, a Mass of the name of Jesus might be sung in a special chapel in the morning, followed later by a votive antiphon. The musical group often attended these as well, bringing polyphony and organ playing into another focused devotional setting beyond the main choir. In some places, the whole choir was involved. In others, the participation was more limited, but the pattern is clear. Monastic authorities increasingly wanted their most beloved and emotionally charged devotions to be marked by the finest music available. The singers were not confined to side chapels. On the great feast days of the church year, they also entered the main monastic choir and contributed to the most solemn public services. Their appearance there could include first vespers, on the eve of a feast, high mass on the day itself, second vespers afterward, and sometimes matins as well. The exact list varied by local custom, but it could amount to a large number of major celebrations each year. On such occasions, the singers probably stood together around a lectern near the choir step, where they could perform as a group and, when needed, be joined by trained monks from the house. Where monasteries supported a full set of professional adult singers, these great feasts saw the most complete musical display. The entire choir of men and boys could then take part in the principal services of the monks' liturgy. Elsewhere, where no adult professionals were employed, the lower parts were sung by monks or canons, whom the director had trained. Some monasteries, however, seem to have drawn a line. In a few important houses, there is evidence that boys were not used in the main choir for festal services, perhaps because of long-standing monastic scruples about the presence of children in that space. In such places, the polyphony sung in the main choir seems to have been performed by adult male voices alone. Even so, the result must still have been striking. On the greatest feasts, the already rich ceremonial life of a late medieval monastery was heightened further by polyphonic settings of the Mass Ordinary, the Magnificat, and other major items, delivered in the expansive and resonant style of early Tudor sacred music. Yet these groups were not full-time choirs in the modern sense. They appeared only at those services selected for musical distinction. The rest of the liturgy remained the responsibility of the monks alone. This had practical consequences. The boys could still live partly as ordinary schoolboys, and most of the adult lay singers were employed only part-time. Only in a few exceptional places did the musical establishment approach the scale of a permanent collegiate foundation. The directors themselves were usually not older, long-established masters at the height of their careers. Because pay was often modest, monasteries tended to attract younger musicians. Men, at the beginning of professional life, who saw the post as useful experience and a stepping stone to more prestigious appointments. Some remained in monastic service for years, but many later moved into important cathedral or other church positions. In a sense, this suited the monasteries well. What they needed most was not celebrity, but energy, ambition, and competence. Young musicians eager to prove themselves were well placed to supply exactly that. Nothing in the surviving evidence suggests that the part-time nature of these choirs, or their relatively small numbers, prevented them from matching the artistic standards of the best secular churches. Even the grandest secular choirs reserved elaborate polyphony for selected services rather than using it constantly. Monastic choirs did the same. Polyphony of this kind did not require massive numbers in order to sound impressive. One skilled singer on each lower part could be enough. What mattered was training, precision, and musical understanding. In repertory, difficulty, and ceremonial effect, the best monastic choirs seem to have stood very close to their secular counterparts. They were not pale imitations. They were serious participants in one of the finest artistic achievements of late medieval English religion. The kind of music performed in monastic churches during this period can best be understood through the manuscripts that survive and the records describing them. Choir books and sets of part books preserve not only the notes themselves, but also reveal the scale of ambition behind these musical programs. Some of the clearest evidence comes from detailed inventories compiled in the 1530s at major institutions such as Worcester and Canterbury. These records offer a rare glimpse into the working repertory of monastic choirs at a time when polyphonic music had become an essential part of their religious life. At Worcester, the arrival of a new musical director triggered a rapid expansion of the repertory. Soon after his appointment, resources were directed toward acquiring new compositions, particularly settings of the Mass. Within a short time, several new Masses had been added, along with more complex works, for multiple voices and additional pieces for major services. Over the following years, further music was copied, including smaller collections, Marian compositions, and other new works. Even the younger singers were provided with their own materials, showing that training and performance were closely connected. The production of music was not limited to hired professionals. Members of the monastic community themselves also contributed by copying elaborate works for use in major liturgical celebrations. An inventory taken in the mid-1530s reveals just how extensive this musical collection had become. The manuscripts were stored alongside the vestments and equipment used for worship, under the supervision of the official responsible for the Lady Chapel. The largest portion of the collection was devoted to music for the Mass. reflecting its central role in daily and festal worship. Multiple choir books contained collections of masses written for different combinations of voices. Some were preserved in older formats, while others were organized into part books that allowed individual singers to follow their own lines. Certain pieces were even kept on parchment rolls, a reminder of earlier traditions of music copying. The collection also included music intended for other parts of the liturgy. There were books for evening devotions in honor of the Virgin, containing elaborate antiphons and hymns. Additional volumes were prepared for use during major feast days, when the singers joined the monks in the main choir. These included settings of important canticles, used in the daily offices, as well as music for processions and special ceremonial occasions. Altogether, the Worcester collection consisted of numerous choir books, several sets of part books, and a variety of loose materials. This range of sources ensured that the singers had access to a wide and challenging repertory, capable of sustaining both daily worship and the more elaborate demands of major festivals. A similar picture emerges from Canterbury, where another inventory from roughly the same period records a comparably rich collection of music. Unlike some monasteries, Canterbury appears to have relied largely on its own monks to provide the adult voices without needing to hire additional professional singers. With a trained director and a group of boys, the monastery could assemble a choir capable of performing music in as many as 6 parts. The manuscripts listed in the inventory include large choir books, smaller collections for fewer voices, and sets of part books containing increasingly complex compositions. Some volumes are associated with particular individuals, suggesting that local patrons or musicians contributed to the growth of the repertory. The music itself covered a wide range of liturgical needs. There were books for mass settings, others for processional music, and still others for the daily offices. Certain volumes contained sequences and additional pieces used in specific devotions, such as the Lady Mass. The presence of music for up to 6 voices indicates that the choir was capable of performing some of the most advanced compositions of the time. Even though not every detail of the collection is recorded, it is clear that Canterbury maintained a repertory, both substantial and technically demanding. The surviving fragments of music confirm the impression given by these inventories. Some monasteries required their musical directors to compose new works each year, ensuring a steady flow of fresh material. At Durham, for example, directors were expected to produce new masses or equivalent compositions annually. A surviving mass dedicated to a local saint shows that such works were tailored to the specific devotional life of each house. Other compositions, including Marian antiphons and settings of the Magnificat, demonstrate the variety and sophistication of the music performed. These pieces were not simple or decorative additions. They were carefully crafted works that matched the standards of the finest music heard elsewhere in the country. Additional evidence shows that monasteries continued to expand their collections in various ways. New compositions were sometimes obtained from prominent musicians working in royal or noble chapels. At other times, existing books were repaired and updated with fresh material. Payments for copying music appear regularly in financial records, indicating a steady investment in maintaining and improving the repertory. In some cases, entire books were transported from distant cities, showing the importance placed on acquiring the latest works. Individual benefactors also contributed, leaving music books to monasteries as part of their legacy. These donations could include multiple volumes of masses and antiphons, further enriching the musical resources of the community. Despite the relatively small size of monastic choirs, this did not limit the scope of the music they performed. While they could not match the sheer volume of sound produced by the largest cathedral choirs, their repertory was remarkably similar in style and complexity. The same types of compositions were used, and the same high level of skill was required to perform them. A smaller group of well-trained singers could still deliver music of great richness and impact. What mattered most was not the number of voices but the quality of training and the ability to handle demanding compositions. The widespread presence of such musical activity suggests that far more monasteries participated in this culture than the surviving records alone might indicate. Although clear evidence exists for around 50 institutions, the true number was likely much higher. By the 1530s, it is reasonable to assume that perhaps close to 100 religious houses had adopted this form of musical enhancement in their worship. In doing so, they were not only enriching their own liturgical life, but also acting as centres of musical training and employment within society. Not everyone viewed these developments positively. Some observers criticised the growing prominence of elaborate music in religious life. They argued that excessive attention to musical display could distract from true devotion and place unnecessary financial burdens on the church. Complaints were raised about the employment of large numbers of singers and the resources devoted to their training. Yet even critics acknowledged the beauty and refinement of the music itself. The tension lay not in the sound, but in the belief that such artistic expression might overshadow the deeper spiritual purpose of worship. Within England, there were also attempts at reform that sought to limit the use of polyphony in certain contexts. Some proposed that only simple chant should be used in the main monastic choir, reserving more elaborate music for separate chapels and devotions. These reforms aimed to preserve a sense of austerity within the core of monastic life, while still allowing musical expression in more appropriate settings. However, such restrictions appear to have had little lasting effect. The broader movement toward richer musical worship continued largely uninterrupted. By the early 16th century, many monasteries had undergone a significant transformation in the way they conducted their services. The introduction of trained singers and complex polyphonic music brought a new level of energy and refinement to their liturgy. These institutions were not static or declining. On the contrary, they demonstrated a clear willingness to adapt, innovate, and engage with the artistic developments of their time. In doing so, they positioned themselves at the forefront of musical culture within the religious world. The contrast with earlier generations is striking. In the late 15th century, monastic worship may have seemed outdated when compared to the evolving practices of secular churches. Yet within a few decades, many monasteries had not only caught up, but had become fully competitive in terms of musical quality and sophistication. Their choirs, though smaller in size, performed music of equal depth and complexity. This transformation reflects a broader pattern of renewal within monastic life during this period. At the same time, these changes may have had unintended consequences. As monastic worship increasingly resembled that of secular institutions, the distinction between the two became less clear. The unique identity of monastic life, already challenged in other ways, may have been further weakened by this convergence. In a time of political and religious upheaval, such shifts could influence how these institutions were perceived, both by those outside them and by the monks themselves. When the dissolution of the monasteries began, the impact was profound. A long-standing tradition of communal religious life was brought to an end. Yet the musical achievements of these communities did not disappear entirely. In many cases, the singers who had served in monastic choirs were retained in new institutions, ensuring continuity in musical practice. Cathedrals, collegiate churches, and royal chapels continue to cultivate the same traditions of polyphonic worship. The work that had been central to monastic life lived on in a different setting. This continuity may help explain the relatively calm acceptance of dissolution by many monastic communities. While their way of life was ending, the core of their spiritual and artistic contribution remained intact. The liturgical tradition, with its rich combination of chant and polyphony, continued to flourish elsewhere. In this sense, the legacy of monastic music extended far beyond the walls of the monasteries themselves, shaping the sound of English worship for generations to come. This overview reveals that the painted decoration found in English monasteries was not random or purely decorative. In many cases, it reflected a deliberate effort to create a distinct form of visual expression shaped by monastic life itself. These artistic programs were often designed by educated members of the community, and their ideas did not remain confined to walls. The themes and inscriptions were copied, shared, and reused in manuscripts and liturgical objects. Even when a painting included no written text, its subject could still be rooted in specialized writings, showing a clear connection between visual art and intellectual tradition. Two remarkable examples of this approach can be found in large-scale depictions of the Apocalypse, one at Westminster and another uncovered at Coventry. These works offer insight into how monastic communities used imagery not only to decorate their spaces but to engage deeply with sacred texts. The discovery of the Coventry fragments has added a new layer to this story, suggesting that such ambitious cycles were more widespread and perhaps more influential than previously thought. By examining both sites together, it becomes possible to better understand how visual art functioned alongside reading and reflection in monastic life. At Westminster, the chapter house is covered with an extensive sequence illustrating the Book of Revelation. This cycle consists of nearly 100 scenes arranged carefully across the walls, each one positioned behind the seating area of a member of the community. The images display a refined style influenced by continental artistic trends, blending Northern European detail with elements inspired by Italian painting. At the eastern end, a larger composition of Christ in judgment dominates the space, marking the position of authority within the room. While some parts of the cycle have suffered damage over time, the surviving sections reveal a level of detail and narrative clarity that speaks to both artistic ambition and careful planning. For a long time, this scheme was considered unique. That perception changed when fragments of a similar cycle were discovered during excavations in Coventry. These pieces, found among the remains of a dismantled chapter house, preserve portions of painted scenes of exceptional quality. Their style suggests they were created several decades earlier than the Westminster paintings. This raises the possibility that the Coventry cycle may have served as an inspiration, directly or indirectly, for the later work in London. The Coventry fragments include scenes that do not appear at Westminster, indicating that the original programme may have been even more extensive. The arrangement of figures shows a more advanced attempt to create depth and movement, suggesting that the artists were working with a sophisticated visual language. Unlike earlier traditions that relied on rigid, compartmentalized compositions, these images present groups of figures interacting within a shared space. This approach reflects broader developments in European art during the later 14th century. The connection between these monumental paintings and illustrated manuscripts is unmistakable. Both cycles draw on established visual traditions developed in books that presented the apocalypse through sequences of images. These manuscripts served as models, providing both the structure of the narrative and the arrangement of individual scenes. At Westminster, it is possible to identify a specific type of illustrated text that guided the design of the paintings. Even so, the artists did not simply copy their sources without change. Adjustments were made to suit the scale and setting of the wall, demonstrating a balance between tradition and adaptation. At Coventry, the exact model remains uncertain, but the relationship to manuscript imagery is still clear. The compositions show signs of transformation, as earlier designs were reinterpreted in a more naturalistic style. This process mirrors developments seen in other major works of the period, where artists updated inherited forms to align with contemporary tastes. In this way, the paintings represent both continuity and innovation, linking the visual culture of manuscripts with the evolving language of monumental art. Text also played an important role in these schemes. At Westminster, written passages were added to accompany the images, allowing viewers to connect the scenes directly to the words of Scripture. Although fewer traces of such text survive at Coventry, the presence of speech scrolls suggests that a similar interaction between image and word existed there as well. These combinations of visual and written elements reflect a broader tradition within monastic art, where meaning was built through multiple layers of interpretation. The physical arrangement of the paintings reinforces their connection to reading. The scenes are relatively small and positioned at eye level, inviting close examination rather than distant viewing. This suggests that they were meant to be studied carefully, much like a manuscript. In this sense, the walls of the chapter house functioned almost like the pages of a book, presenting a continuous narrative that could be followed step by step. The setting itself, a space used for gathering, discussion, and discipline, added further meaning to the imagery. The choice of the apocalypse as a subject is particularly significant. This is not a simple or straightforward text. Its complex symbolism, dramatic imagery, and layered meanings demand careful attention. In parish churches, such complexity was usually avoided in favour of more direct representations of judgment. Yet, within a monastic environment, the apocalypse offered an opportunity for deeper engagement. The monks were familiar with its language and themes, often reciting portions of it as part of their daily routine. This familiarity allowed the images to serve not as basic instruction, but as a means of reflection and renewal. The act of viewing these paintings may have resembled the slow and deliberate reading practiced in monastic life. Each scene could be considered individually, its meaning explored through memory and contemplation. Rather than presenting something entirely new, the images brought familiar passages to life in a different form. This process encouraged a deeper connection to the text, allowing the viewer to revisit known material with fresh attention. The function of the chapter house itself adds another layer to this interpretation. This was a place associated with discipline, confession, and communal decision-making. The presence of imagery centered on judgment and salvation would have reinforced the moral and spiritual purpose of these gatherings. The large image of Christ as judge, positioned prominently within the space, served as a constant reminder of accountability and divine authority. At the same time, the complexity of the narrative invited ongoing engagement beyond formal meetings. The paintings were not designed to be understood in a single glance. Their full meaning unfolded gradually, requiring time and familiarity. This aligns with the broader monastic emphasis on repeated reflection, where understanding deepens through continued exposure rather than immediate comprehension. The discovery of the Coventry fragments highlights how much has been lost from the visual culture of monasteries. What survives is only a small portion of what once existed. Yet even these fragments reveal a world in which art was closely connected to study, memory, and spiritual practice. The quality of the painting suggests that many similar works, now destroyed, must once have enriched monastic spaces across the country. These cycles demonstrate that images in monastic settings were never merely decorative. They were part of a larger intellectual and devotional system. By drawing on written sources, incorporating text, and encouraging careful observation, they bridged the gap between reading and seeing. In doing so, they offered a form of engagement that complemented the core practices of monastic life. Ultimately, these works show how visual art could function alongside scripture rather than in place of it. The images did not replace the written word, nor were they secondary to it. Instead, they provided another way of approaching the same material, allowing familiar themes to be experienced in a new form. Through repetition, attention, and reflection, They supported a way of thinking that was central to monastic culture. The broader concept of monastic life itself helps to explain this approach. For a medieval monk, daily existence was structured around worship, discipline, and study. Reading was not simply an intellectual activity, but part of a spiritual routine. Time was carefully organized to ensure that every moment contributed to this purpose. Even when not engaged in formal duties, monks were expected to occupy themselves with prayer, reading, or useful work. Within this framework, the idea of leisure took on a different meaning. It was not about rest or entertainment, but about stepping away from worldly concerns in order to focus on deeper truths. This kind of withdrawal created space for reflection and contemplation. In such an environment, art that encouraged thoughtful engagement with sacred texts would have been not only appropriate, but essential. A short medieval treatise once compared the life of a hermit to a grazing sheep. The image may seem simple, but its meaning is precise. A sheep wastes nothing. From it come wool, milk, meat, and leather. In the same way, the ideal religious life was expected to produce constant spiritual benefit. Every thought, every action, every effort had to serve a purpose. This idea shaped the vision of a disciplined monk, whose inner life was carefully directed toward meaningful results. Nothing idle, nothing scattered, nothing without value. Writings connected to English monastic life reveal how this disciplined spirituality was understood in practice. They offer glimpses into a world where growth did not come through casual learning, but through deep internal formation. One account describes a young boy who once loved games and competition, but suddenly abandoned them after an unexpected encounter. From that moment on, his education no longer came from ordinary instruction. Instead, it was described as an inward teaching, guided by a higher force. This reflects a central belief of monastic culture. True understanding was not only learned from teachers, but shaped within the mind and heart, forming a new way of thinking and living. This process aimed at transformation. The monk was expected to become a reflection of something greater, almost a small image of a heavenly order while still living on earth. That transformation was not sudden, but gradual, built through discipline, study, and reflection. The goal was a state where thought and faith were united, where knowledge was no longer separate from spiritual experience. Examples of this ideal appear in the lives of notable figures. One man, dedicated from childhood to religious life, was described as having never tasted worldly pleasures. He avoided games, avoided distraction, and devoted himself entirely to learning and contemplation. His days and nights were filled with reflection on spiritual teaching, and over time, he became known for his insight and understanding. This kind of life was not seen as restrictive, but as deeply fulfilling, offering a different kind of joy, rooted in clarity and purpose. Another influential figure approached the monastic life from a different angle, emphasizing relationships within the community. In his view, friendship between monks was not simply social, but spiritual. Two individuals in conversation were never truly alone. Their dialogue was imagined as taking place in the presence of a third, a divine presence that shaped and guided their exchange. Friendship itself became a form of discipline, a way of refining thought and character through shared reflection. This idea extended into a broader vision of community. The monastic life was rarely solitary. Even though some chose isolation, most lived together, forming tightly connected groups. These communities were small, but they saw themselves as part of a much larger reality. They believed they were participating in a greater order that extended beyond time and space. Living together in unity was not only practical, but symbolic of a higher harmony. Within this environment, examples played a crucial role. Stories of earlier saints were read and repeated, not simply for inspiration, but as guides for behaviour. These figures were presented as models of virtue, demonstrating how discipline, humility, and focus could shape a life. One description portrays a saint as a living school of virtue, a guide whose actions formed a pattern others could follow. Through such examples, ideals were made concrete. Friendship within these communities, however, required careful balance. It had to support unity rather than create division. Personal affection was expected to serve a higher purpose, reinforcing the shared values of the group. Even letters exchanged between monks followed this principle. They were often written in a way that emphasized collective identity rather than individual emotion. A message sent to one could be shared with another, because the ideas within it were meant to apply equally to all. This created a sense of connection that extended beyond physical presence, forming a network of relationships based on shared understanding. Communication itself became a bridge between absence and presence. Writing to a distant friend was treated almost as a form of conversation. Words carried meaning across distance, allowing individuals to remain connected even when separated. This idea was not unique to monastic life, but within these communities it took on a deeper significance, reinforcing the sense of unity that defined their culture. Education within the monastery also reflected this dual nature of thought and devotion. Learning was not purely academic. It was intertwined with spiritual practice. A teacher guided students not only in reasoning, but in reflection. Intellectual effort and devotion worked together, forming a single process. In some cases, writing alternated between careful argument and emotional expression, showing how reasoning and belief could exist side by side. At the same time, monastic life did not reject knowledge. It simply approached it differently. Technical skill and formal learning were valued, but they were not the ultimate goal. True understanding was believed to come from deeper insight rather than complex language or rigid systems. Knowledge had to serve truth, not overshadow it. This perspective created a tension between emerging academic traditions and older monastic ideals. Despite this, monasteries remained deeply engaged with learning, especially in the study of sacred texts. One of the best examples comes from a northern religious community where records of books and resources survive in remarkable detail. Over several centuries, this group built an extensive collection of materials for study. Their library grew steadily, reflecting both continuity and adaptation as new methods of interpretation developed. At first, their collection included foundational texts, especially those focused on interpretation and explanation. Over time, the range expanded, incorporating new tools that helped organize and clarify complex material. By the 12th century, the collection had become far more diverse, including works that supported both teaching and deeper analysis. This growth shows how seriously the community took the study of scripture. Later, developments brought even greater change. New methods of commentary began to spread, offering more structured ways of understanding texts. The monks adopted these tools, gradually building a comprehensive set of resources. Generous patrons contributed to this expansion, providing high-quality materials that strengthened the collection. These contributions were not random. They reflected a shared understanding of what the community needed, suggesting careful planning and coordination. By the end of the 12th century, the collection had reached a point where it could support advanced study. This marked an important moment, allowing the monks to engage with complex ideas on equal terms with scholars elsewhere. Their approach remained distinct, however. While others focused on debate and innovation, the monks used their knowledge to deepen their understanding of familiar material. As time passed, the focus shifted again. New types of reference tools became popular, and the monks incorporated them into their library. These tools allowed quicker access to information and helped organize large amounts of material. Their use reflects a growing awareness of efficiency and structure in study, even within a tradition that valued slow reflection. The influence of broader intellectual movements can also be seen in the presence of individuals who studied outside the monastery and returned with new ideas. Some of these figures played a key role in expanding the collection, bringing with them materials acquired during their studies. This exchange between the monastery and the wider world shows that monastic culture was not isolated. It interacted with external developments while maintaining its own priorities. By the late medieval period, the scale of resources available to these monks had increased significantly. Larger collections, more organized systems, and dedicated study spaces allowed for a more structured approach to learning. Yet the underlying purpose remained unchanged. Study was not an end in itself, but a means of spiritual growth. Even as methods evolved, the connection between knowledge and devotion continued to define monastic life. Reading was not simply about acquiring information. It was a disciplined activity, tied to reflection and personal transformation. The repeated study of familiar texts was seen as a path toward deeper understanding, not through novelty, but through sustained attention. This combination of discipline, community, and intellectual effort created a distinctive cultural environment. It was a world where every activity, from conversation to study, served a higher purpose. The monastery became a place where thought was shaped, refined, and directed toward a single goal. Not the accumulation of knowledge for its own sake, but the gradual formation of a mind capable of clarity, balance, and inner peace. Around the middle of the 14th century, a record was created that offers a rare window into the intellectual life of a northern monastic community. It lists roughly 140 volumes, though it is clearly incomplete. Even in its fragmented form, it reveals a carefully structured system of organization. The books were not kept in a single place or treated as a uniform collection. Instead, they were divided according to use and importance. The most frequently consulted works were kept close at hand, while others were placed in a separate storage area, a secure chamber connected to the cloister. This secondary collection served several purposes. Some of the works stored there had simply fallen out of favor, no longer central to current study. Others were duplicates, retained not for constant use, but for flexibility. These extra copies could be lent out, relocated, or used elsewhere without disrupting daily activity. When books were later sent to a distant study centre, many of them were drawn from this reserve, showing how the system allowed for both preservation and practical use. The surviving portion of the catalogue begins with texts related to the Psalms, though earlier sections are missing. Even so, what remains is striking. Dozens of volumes are listed, the majority of them not simple texts, but enriched with commentary and interpretive material. Some contained older forms of annotation, written in margins or between lines, while others presented more developed and continuous explanations. The distinction between these formats reflects an evolution in how knowledge was organized and transmitted. What stands out most is the overwhelming emphasis on interpretation rather than raw text. Only a handful of entries refer to plain versions without additional guidance. This suggests that the monks were not merely reading, but actively engaging, seeking deeper meaning through layers of commentary. Such a concentration of interpretive material was not unique, but it does underline how central the Psalms were to daily life. Their repeated use in ritual made them both familiar and essential, encouraging a level of study that went beyond simple repetition. The catalogue continues with other sections, including prophetic writings, again dominated by annotated versions. Occasionally, a less common work appears, indicating that not all texts enjoyed equal popularity. Some were set aside, perhaps because they were difficult, less useful, or simply overshadowed by more widely studied material. Yet over time, even these could be reassessed and brought back into circulation, showing that the value of a text was not fixed, but subject to changing priorities. Alongside this inventory of stored works, there is evidence of another collection used more directly in daily life. This included books kept within the cloister itself, where reading and instruction took place. Among these were tools designed to assist in navigating large bodies of text, such as early forms of concordances. These tools allowed readers to locate themes, ideas, and passages more efficiently, reflecting a growing interest in organization and accessibility. Equally revealing is a small group of texts associated with communal reading during meals. These were not chosen at random. They often included foundational works, drawn from respected authorities, and were likely intended for those still in training. As food was consumed, so too was knowledge, delivered in structured readings that reinforced both discipline and learning. The choice of material suggests a deliberate effort to shape the intellectual and spiritual development of younger members. Over time, the selection of these readings appears to have shifted. Later lists show a greater emphasis on narrative and biography, particularly stories of exemplary lives. Yet, it is unlikely that earlier practices were entirely abandoned. Instead, different types of material may have been used side by side, some offering inspiration, others providing more demanding content. This layered approach allowed for both engagement and instruction, balancing accessibility with depth. A major turning point came toward the end of the century, when the community invested in a large and ambitious project. New and highly regarded body of commentary was commissioned, reflecting both intellectual ambition and a response to wider debates of the time. The work required skilled scribes and considerable resources, and its production was treated as a matter of importance. It represented not only a commitment to scholarship, but also a determination to remain competitive in an environment where knowledge itself had become a form of authority. Once completed, these volumes were integrated into the main collection, which by the late 14th century had reached a high level of organization. Books were arranged by subject, grouped into distinct sections that made navigation more systematic. The arrangement itself reveals how knowledge was categorized, with sacred texts occupying a central place, supported by layers of interpretation and commentary. Within this system, large-scale works by major authors were often kept together, forming dedicated clusters. While this preserved coherence, it also meant that related material could be scattered across different sections. A reader seeking a particular theme might need to move between multiple locations, relying on memory or guidance rather than browsing. This suggests a level of familiarity with the collection that went beyond casual use. The structure of the collection also reflects practical concerns. Certain types of books were placed where they would be most useful for daily routines, including teaching and administration. Others were positioned for ease of reference, particularly those needed for study or preparation. Over time, adjustments were made to improve access, including the recognition that a more unified system would be helpful. A significant reorganization took place in the early 15th century with the creation of a dedicated space for books. This new environment allowed for a different approach. Instead of grouping works strictly by author, they could now be arranged by subject, bringing related material into closer proximity. This made it easier to see connections and to locate information, reducing reliance on memory alone. The reorganization also freed up space in other areas, allowing for shifts in emphasis. Additional material was brought into the main areas of use, including works designed to support preaching and practical application. This indicates a growing interest in using knowledge actively, not just preserving it. At the same time, a new kind of tool became increasingly important. Indexes and guides were created to help navigate complex texts. offering structured pathways through dense material. These tools were not only collected, but also produced locally, showing that the community was not merely adopting innovations, but contributing to them. Their widespread use demonstrates how the nature of study was changing, becoming more systematic and efficient. By the late medieval period, the accumulation of these resources had reached a peak. The collection was extensive, varied, and supported by a range of tools that made it highly functional. Yet the purpose behind it all remained consistent. The goal was not simply to gather books, but to create an environment where knowledge could be applied, interpreted, and integrated into daily life. Even as new methods and technologies emerged, including the introduction of printed works, the underlying approach did not disappear. Instead, older traditions and newer developments coexisted. Some individuals began to acquire their own books, marking them with notes that reveal how they were used. These annotations provide rare insight into personal engagement, showing how texts were studied, interpreted, and adapted. Interestingly, not all books were treated in the same way. Some were heavily marked, suggesting careful, continuous reading. Others show little sign of such attention, not because they were ignored, but because they were used differently. Many were consulted selectively, opened when needed rather than read from beginning to end. This pattern reflects a practical approach, where books served as resources rather than narratives. In certain cases, however, a more sustained engagement is visible. Extensive notes appear throughout entire sections, indicating a deeper level of study. These moments reveal how knowledge could move from reference to reflection, from occasional consultation to continuous exploration. John of St. Germans was not alone. Around him, a small but active circle of scholar monks formed at Worcester, leaving their traces not in grand declarations, but in the margins, notes, and structure of books. Among the most visible figures in this group were John Preston, Henry Folk, and Richard Bromwich, men whose intellectual lives can still be followed through the manuscripts they handled. John Preston appears in the records in the mid-14th century, already connected to Worcester and later studying at Oxford. He lived through a turbulent period marked by intellectual change and the shadow of the Black Death. His handwriting, though less distinctive than others, appears in several volumes, suggesting steady involvement in reading, annotating, and transmitting texts. He also donated books to the monastery, indicating both personal investment in learning and a sense of communal responsibility for knowledge. Henry Folk stands out more clearly. His career within the monastery included several important roles, and although direct proof of his university education is lacking, the sophistication of his work leaves little doubt about his training. He was deeply concerned with making books usable. He added page numbers, created indexes, and organized texts so that information could be easily found. His activity reveals a practical mind, someone less interested in abstract theory than in ensuring that knowledge could be accessed and applied. He treated books not as static objects, but as tools. Richard Bromwich, by contrast, expressed his presence in a more vivid way. His annotations are recognizable not only for their content, but for their style. He often decorated his notes with small, almost playful drawings of monks' heads, giving a human touch to the otherwise serious work of scholarship. Like Preston, he focused mainly on annotation, but his personality emerges more clearly from the page. He also authored at least one major work, a commentary on theological texts, showing that this circle was not only consuming knowledge, but also producing it. These men did not work in isolation. Their collaboration is one of the most striking features of this intellectual environment. Manuscripts passed from one to another, often being expanded and reorganized, or annotated along the way. A book acquired in Paris might later be indexed by one monk, annotated by another, and eventually incorporated into the monastery's collection. Some volumes contain layers of contributions, reflecting years of shared use. This was not a static library, but a living system of knowledge, constantly reshaped by its users. Beyond this central group, other monks were also active in academic life, though perhaps less visibly connected to the circle. Some studied at Oxford, gaining advanced degrees and contributing to theological teaching. Others left behind notebooks filled with lecture notes, sermon outlines, and logical exercises. These documents reveal the structure of medieval education, rooted in debate, commentary, and the careful interpretation of authoritative texts. The contents of their books reflect this educational world. Many were standard academic works, theological manuals, philosophical treatises, and collections of commentary. Others were more practical, including sermons and teaching materials. Some manuscripts were professionally produced, likely purchased in university towns, while others were copied by the monks themselves. In certain cases, worn-out commercial texts were acquired and reused, showing a pragmatic approach to resources. Books circulated widely within this environment. They were bought, exchanged, borrowed, and sometimes even pledged as security for loans. Despite official rules against such practices, evidence shows that manuscripts frequently moved between individuals and institutions. This circulation allowed knowledge to spread, but also created the risk of loss. A monastery could lose valuable texts through the very academic networks it depended on. The broader context helps explain both the energy and the fragility of this intellectual culture. The devastating impact of the Black Death likely disrupted monastic education, reducing both the number of scholars and the continuity of learning. Yet the surviving evidence shows that, at least for a time, Worcester maintained a vibrant scholarly community. For a long time, the closing centuries of English monastic life were described in dark and simple terms, as though the religious houses of England had spent their final generations in moral collapse, spiritual emptiness, and institutional decay. According to that older picture, the period before the dissolution was little more than a slow descent toward ruin, with monasteries and nunneries drifting toward extinction after losing the seriousness that had once defined them. Yet that view no longer holds up when the surviving evidence is examined carefully. The reality was far more uneven and far more human. Some communities certainly suffered from poverty, weak discipline, or local difficulties, but the broader pattern does not reveal a universal world of corruption. What appears instead is something less dramatic and much more believable. A landscape shaped by variation, limitation, recovery, and effort. In many houses, both male and female, religious life did not simply wither away. From the later 15th century onward, there are strong signs of renewed seriousness, renewed learning, and renewed engagement with spiritual culture. The older story of a bright beginning followed by irreversible decline has become too crude to explain what was actually happening inside these communities. That reassessment matters especially in the case of women's houses, because their intellectual and spiritual lives were for a long time underestimated. It is easy enough to point to isolated cases of hardship or disorder. Some communities were poor enough to struggle for survival. Others depended heavily on local charity. Some famous houses stood apart because of their wealth, influence, or prestige, and could not be taken as typical. Yet the same is true in reverse. The weakest examples cannot stand for every nunnery in England. Conditions differed from region to region and from house to house. A convent with strong patrons, capable leadership, and access to books might look very different from one burdened by debt or local neglect. Once that variety is acknowledged, the surviving material begins to suggest that many women, religious, were far more engaged readers than earlier scholarship allowed. Their culture may not always have been brilliant, but it was often thoughtful, disciplined, and serious. the evidence points less to dramatic degeneracy than to ordinary limitations, interrupted by moments of striking vitality. One of the clearest ways to see this is by looking not only at what books nuns owned or used, but at how they experienced those books. A manuscript in the Middle Ages was never just a container of words. It was a visual and physical object designed to guide attention, shape devotion, and direct the reader through an ordered experience. Illumination, decorated initials, spacing, arrangement, and visual emphasis all formed part of the work's meaning. A psalter filled with images, for example, was not simply a prayer book with illustrations added for beauty. Its pictures were part of the spiritual encounter itself. The reader was expected to linger over them, reflect on them, and absorb them as fully as the written prayers. Images did not stand beside the text as ornaments. They functioned as another form of text. In that world, meditation could happen through looking as much as through reading. To pass slowly over an image with concentrated thought could be as spiritually productive as reciting a psalm. The same principle applied to the wider arrangement of the page. Medieval books used visual signals in ways that modern readers often overlook. Large initials, colour changes, spacing, and layout were not accidental matters of decoration. They structured attention. They taught the eye where to pause, where to begin again, and what deserved emphasis. A manuscript page was constructed to be navigated, almost like a patterned field of meaning, where reading moved through both words and form. Two copies of the same text could create very different effects if their layout differed. The visual design altered the rhythm of encounter. For this reason, any serious account of what religious women read must also ask how they met the page itself. The physical book shaped devotion as surely as the text it carried. To understand these women only by listing titles is not enough. The deeper question is how books were lived with, handled, contemplated, and inwardly absorbed. There is another area that deserves equal attention: the practical documents of women's houses. Spiritual books survive more visibly and draw more attention, but administrative records also reveal the world these women inhabited. Rentals, cartularias, account books, legal records, and wills show abbesses and prioresses managing land, rents, disputes, obligations, and household affairs with considerable competence. Such material may seem less inspiring than devotional literature, but it opens a different and equally important view of female religious life. Behind the choir, the cloister, and the library stood a demanding institutional reality. A house had to be sustained, property had to be administered, staff had to be directed, tenants had to be dealt with, lawsuits and financial arrangements had to be understood. These duties required literacy, judgment, and discipline. In many cases, the women responsible for such work emerge not as passive figures enclosed in spiritual abstraction, but as capable administrators navigating a complex social and economic environment. Their reading culture cannot be separated from that broader life of management and responsibility. Wills and personal bequests add another layer to the picture. As more testamentary records are studied, more traces appear of books passing to nuns, convents, and female communities. These gifts show that religious women stood within networks of exchange linking monastery and world. Books moved through friendship, kinship, patronage, and devotion. Such evidence may never produce a complete record, but it suggests a richer literary environment than once imagined. It also shows how much remains hidden in scattered archives and local collections. The study of medieval religious women advances less through dramatic discoveries than through patient recovery. Each newly identified rental, charter, inscription, or bequest adds another piece to a larger pattern. Taken together, these fragments continue to weaken the old assumption that women's monastic life in late medieval England had become intellectually empty before it was destroyed. This broader rethinking becomes even more vivid when attention shifts from institutional life to the quieter matter of private reading. Monastic reading is often imagined as a communal act. A text is heard in the refectory during meals, recited in chapter, or delivered aloud during the shared rhythm of the day. That image is correct, but incomplete. By the 15th and early 16th centuries, opportunities for more personal reading had expanded inside women's religious houses. This change was connected to a larger transformation in how reading was practiced. Older forms depended heavily on hearing. Newer forms increasingly depended on the solitary eye. As space within religious life became more private, reading, too, became more inward. This did not mean that communal reading disappeared, but it no longer held the field alone. Two practical developments encouraged this shift. One was the weakening of shared dining. The other was the gradual division of the common dormitory into smaller private spaces. Both changes were criticized repeatedly by church authorities, who feared that privacy would undermine discipline and community. Yet those same developments also opened new possibilities for personal devotion. When meals were no longer always taken together in the refectory, the common hearing of a text read aloud could no longer shape every member of the house in the same way. Smaller meals, separate rooms, and reduced collective attendance meant that the old auditory culture weakened. In its place, there may have grown a stronger habit of solitary reading. Likewise, when partitions or enclosed sleeping areas transformed a large dormitory into a series of individual spaces, the conditions for quiet reading increased. A woman who possessed even a little privacy possessed a new setting in which a book might be opened, pondered, and reread away from the full gaze of the community. The rules of religious life had long made room for reading, but they imagined it within a strongly ordered day. In some traditions, books were provided at set hours and not outside them. The meal itself was joined to listening, so that physical nourishment and the hearing of sacred words were linked. Other moments, such as the evening gathering after supper, also made space for spiritual reading. Yet over time, these formal occasions were accompanied by more personal habits. Reading could happen before work began. It could happen in the quiet interval after the main meal. It could happen, perhaps, at the close of the day, in the moments before sleep. Advice written for religious women suggests that devotional books might be read especially at night, or in the early morning, when the mind could turn inward more easily. In such moments, the day's public structure gave way to something more intimate and reflective. The spaces in which this reading took place are just as important as the times. In secular households, the late medieval and early modern periods saw the rise of more specialized rooms for privacy, devotion, and business. Something similar appears to have been happening in religious houses. Cells or partitioned sleeping areas offered a degree of solitude that earlier communal arrangements had resisted. Even a very small space could matter. Inventories from dissolved nunneries reveal tiny rooms containing beds, chests, cushions, curtains, dishes, devotional images, and sometimes decorative touches that made the space feel distinctly personal. These were not grand interiors, but they were inhabited spaces shaped by individual use. Books, too, were almost certainly kept there, stored in coffers or cupboards, and brought out for reading in private hours. Such rooms make visible the presence of individual life within institutions that outwardly emphasized shared rule and common identity. What sort of books were read in these solitary moments? Some were the expected devotional works that circulated widely among religious readers. Texts of prayer, reflection, and spiritual instruction were copied, owned, shared, and used over long periods. Some books were more personal and less predictable. Small manuscripts connected to individual nuns survive in forms that suggest intimate use rather than formal library ownership. Their pages are worn, darkened, altered by handling, and sometimes written in more than one hand. They look like living objects, books shaped through repeated contact. Such manuscripts reveal something important. Religious women did not simply receive whatever reading their house prescribed. They also sought particular texts, gathered meaningful pieces together, copied material for themselves, and formed personal collections suited to their inner lives. Even in communities where ownership was theoretically restricted, private devotional books had become common by the late Middle Ages. These personal books show a quiet but significant kind of choice. A woman might ask a spiritual advisor for guidance to support her profession. She might preserve prayers or meditations that answered her own needs. She might gather short devotional texts into a small manuscript that could be kept close at hand. In doing so, she stepped into a more individualized relation with reading. This does not mean she ceased to be a member of a community, but it does mean that spiritual life was not only received from above in fixed forms. It was also shaped through selection, repetition, memory, and personal attachment. Such manuscripts stand somewhere between the collective culture of the cloister and the later world of individual devotional reading that would grow even stronger in the centuries to come. The act of reading itself was also understood differently from modern silent consumption of text. Reading was expected to move the whole person. It demanded preparation, attention, and retention. Advice given to religious women often recommended beginning with prayer, asking for grace before opening a book. Once the reading was done, the reader was urged to pause, remember what had been read, and carry it forward in the mind. Reading was not complete when the eyes left the page. Its proper end was remembrance, meditation, and inward change. In that sense, reading remained a spiritual exercise rather than a merely intellectual one. Even when practiced alone, it was connected to prayer, self-examination, and moral formation. That older monastic habit of rumination remained especially important. A text was not only read, but taken in slowly, repeated inwardly, and worked into memory. The reader might murmur words softly, retrace them mentally, or even copy them out in order to deepen possession of them. Writing and reading could overlap. A nun in a library might not simply consult a book, she might gather excerpts, form a small personal collection, or commit passages to memory through quiet repetition. Even the careful darkening or retracing of letters in a manuscript may have belonged to this intimate mode of reading, where physical engagement with the page reinforced inner absorption. The goal was not speed. It was familiarity so deep that the text could be summoned without the book. Emotional response mattered as well. Some devotional works were intended not just to inform but to stir feeling. Readers were taught to respond differently to different kinds of passages. Words of warning should awaken fear. Words of mercy should bring comfort. Narratives of suffering should call forth compassion. In this way, reading formed the emotions as much as the intellect. A woman was not merely to understand the text, she was to inhabit it, to allow it to shape her inner state. This training in effective reading encouraged a form of inwardness that fitted well with the rise of private spaces and private hours. Alone in a small room, with a familiar devotional text, a reader could move deeply into meditation, memory, and feeling. That experience points toward a more interior religious life, not necessarily less disciplined than the old communal model, but differently structured. Seen from this angle, the growth of privacy within women's religious houses should not be described too simply as a symptom of decline. It certainly troubled visitors and reformers, and it did alter the old communal ideal. But it also created conditions for new devotional habits, smaller rooms, separate dining, personal books, and chosen reading times all contributed to a different way of living with texts. Reading became more solitary, more selective, and more inward. In that shift lies an important part of the story of late medieval women's religious culture. These nuns were not merely passive remnants of a dying tradition. Many were active participants in a changing world of devotion and literacy, adapting inherited practices to new conditions without abandoning seriousness of purpose. The larger conclusion is clear. The intellectual and spiritual lives of late medieval English nuns were long judged through assumptions that no longer stand. Their communities were varied, their circumstances uneven, and their surviving traces incomplete. But the evidence that remains points toward a culture more substantial than the old stereotypes allowed. Their books were not empty relics. Their reading was not mechanical. Their institutions were not universally corrupt or spiritually dead. What emerges instead is a world of women who prayed, read, managed, remembered, selected, copied, and reflected within the particular conditions of their houses. Their lives were shaped by tradition, but not frozen by it. Their reading could be public or private, communal or inward, audible or silent. But in each form it contributed to a serious religious life. Far from confirming an easy tale of terminal decline, the surviving evidence reveals a richer and more complex final age of English monasticism, one in which women religious remained intellectually and spiritually engaged until the very end. In the early months of 1517, at a moment when Europe stood on the edge of profound religious change, an English bishop undertook a very different kind of reform. Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester, turned his attention not to public controversy, but to the inner life of convents under his care. He produced a clear and accessible English version of the Benedictine rule for women, followed by a detailed guide to the ceremony through which nuns formally entered religious life. These works were not abstract exercises. They were written in response to a practical need, shaped by real communities, and grounded in direct contact with the women who would use them. Fox was not writing in isolation. The leading women of 4 religious houses in his diocese actively sought his help. Their request was urgent and deliberate. They wanted a version of the rule that could be understood fully, not merely heard in fragments or explained unevenly. Many nuns could not follow the Latin text with confidence, and even when translations were offered aloud, uncertainty remained. The women themselves recognized that this gap in understanding weakened their ability to live their vocation with clarity. Their appeal to the bishop reveals something important. These communities were not passive recipients of instruction. They were capable of identifying problems and taking initiative to address them. Fox responded by producing a translation designed to be direct, practical, and usable. He chose plain English that could be read, remembered, and taught within the convent. His aim was not simply to transmit the rule, but to make it effective. A text that could not be understood, he believed, could not guide action. Knowledge was not optional. It was essential to the life the nuns had chosen. In this sense, the translation was part of a broader vision of reform. It sought to align understanding, discipline, and daily practice. The bishop himself had undergone a shift in priorities. After many years in royal service, he returned to his diocese with a sense that his earlier work had distracted him from spiritual responsibility. He began to examine the condition of the religious houses under his authority, looking for weaknesses and opportunities for renewal. The problem of language and comprehension stood out immediately. If the rule remained inaccessible, then the foundation of monastic life itself was weakened. By translating it, Fox hoped to restore a direct connection between text and practice. The women who requested the translation were not inexperienced or powerless. Heads of religious houses managed complex institutions. They oversaw worship, discipline, education, finances, property, and personnel. Their responsibilities extended beyond the cloister into the surrounding community. They negotiated legal matters, handled income and expenditure, supervised staff, and ensured the daily running of the house. Such roles required intelligence, judgment, and authority. The request for a translation of the rule was therefore not a simple appeal for help, but a strategic decision aimed at strengthening the intellectual and spiritual foundations of their communities. Education formed a central part of this vision. A nun was not expected to remain ignorant of the life she had entered. On the contrary, she was expected to understand it, to reflect on it, and to grow within it. Some women arrived already able to read and write, sometimes even in Latin. Others developed these skills after entering the convent. In either case, learning was not limited to basic literacy. It extended into theology, devotion, and the interpretation of religious texts. In some houses, nuns read widely, engaging with both spiritual works and historical writings. They formed relationships with clergy who supported their intellectual development. The translation of the rule was meant to support and extend this culture of learning. At the same time, Fox made it clear that women were not to be treated as lesser versions of male monastics. He preserved the full content of the rule, even where it referred specifically to men, allowing nuns to understand the broader tradition from which their own practices differed. He did not attempt to reshape the text by removing difficult or unfamiliar material. Instead, he trusted his readers to engage with it intelligently. Where adjustments were necessary, they were practical rather than ideological, reflecting local customs or conditions. He also showed an awareness of the lived experience of women. His explanations often drew on familiar aspects of daily life, using examples that would resonate with his audience. He understood that religious life did not erase memory. Women who entered the convent carried with them knowledge of family, household, and society. These experiences could be used to illuminate spiritual truths, rather than ignored or suppressed. His language reflects this approach, translating abstract ideas into vivid, relatable terms. In his treatment of moral discipline, Fox expanded brief instructions into fuller reflections on behaviour. He recognized that faults were not always dramatic. They often took the form of small habits that disrupted harmony. Taking what belonged to others, speaking carelessly, or allowing resentment to grow. By addressing these issues directly, he aimed to strengthen the communal life of the convent. Discipline was not simply about obedience. It was about maintaining a stable and cooperative environment in which each member could fulfill her role. He described the convent as a family, structured by relationships of care and responsibility. The abbess was not only a superior but a maternal figure, guiding and protecting the community. The nuns were bound together not just by rules, but by shared life. Within this framework, authority was balanced by mutual dependence. Each member contributed to the whole, and the success of the community depended on cooperation rather than control alone. The ceremony of profession reinforced this sense of belonging. It was not a private moment, but a public and communal act. The newly professed nun entered the life of the house through a carefully structured ritual that combined symbolism, participation, and shared worship. She took part in the liturgy, offered gifts, and received communion in a way that marked her full integration into the community. The ritual emphasized both individual commitment and collective identity. For Fox, spiritual growth required effort and discipline. Holiness was not achieved automatically. It demanded attention, persistence, and self-awareness. He acknowledged human weakness, including the tendency to delay important tasks or avoid difficult responsibilities. His advice addressed these realities directly, encouraging focus and determination. He did not present the religious life as effortless. Instead, he described it as a skilled practice, requiring tools, training, and continual application. This idea of religious life as a craft shaped his entire approach. Just as a skilled worker uses proper tools to complete a task, a nun required spiritual practices to shape her life. These included prayer, study, discipline, and reflection. Through these means, she could bring order to her thoughts, actions, and relationships. The goal was not only personal improvement, but participation in a larger, ordered community. That community, in turn, was expected to function effectively. Fox emphasized the importance of knowledge, cooperation, and responsibility in maintaining a well-run house. Each member needed to understand her role and carry it out competently. When this happened, the convent became a stable and productive environment, capable of fulfilling its spiritual purpose. When it failed, disorder and conflict followed. Evidence from the period shows that many houses did function in this way. Some convents maintained regular worship, disciplined routines, and stable finances. Their members carried out their duties with consistency and cooperation. Others struggled with internal conflict, mismanagement, or declining standards. These variations reflect the reality of human institutions, rather than a single pattern of decline. Even in less successful communities, the problems were often practical rather than purely moral. Buildings required repair, resources were limited, and leadership could falter. Disputes arose between individuals or groups. Such difficulties did not necessarily indicate a collapse of religious ideals. They show instead the tension between aspiration and reality that exists in any structured community. At the same time, convents were not isolated from the wider world. They maintained connections with families, local communities, and patrons. They provided education, charity, and spiritual services. They participated in local life while maintaining a distinct identity. This balance created both strength and risk. Engagement with the outside world could support the convent, but it could also introduce distractions. The life of a nun, as envisioned by Fox and the women he served, was therefore complex. It combined separation and connection, discipline and adaptability, tradition and reform. It required knowledge, cooperation, and personal commitment. It was not defined solely by withdrawal from the world, but by a structured way of living within it. This vision challenges simpler narratives about the period. It does not present convents as declining institutions waiting to disappear. Instead, it reveals communities actively engaged in maintaining and improving their way of life. The translation of the rule stands as a clear example of this effort. It reflects a shared recognition that understanding, discipline, and practice must be aligned if religious life is to remain meaningful. On the eve of great upheaval, these communities were not static. They were adapting, learning, and refining their identity. Their efforts did not prevent the changes that followed, but they show that the final years of English monastic life were marked not only by endings, but by deliberate attempts at renewal. Life inside a medieval English monastery followed a rhythm that was both strict and deeply structured. These communities left behind a remarkable number of records, allowing historians to reconstruct their routines with considerable precision. Monks lived under a clearly defined rule that governed nearly every hour of their day, from prayer and study to work and rest. Yet while institutional life is well documented, the personal side of these individuals remains far more obscure. Only a handful of notebooks and letters survive, and even these rarely provide the kind of detailed personal insight that modern readers might expect. The intellectual and spiritual atmosphere of these monasteries is even harder to grasp. Unlike material routines, inner thoughts and cultural attitudes do not leave clear traces. Still, some patterns can be identified. Monastic culture rested on a balance between learning and devotion. Scripture formed its foundation. supported by the writings of early Christian thinkers, and shaped further by the legacy of classical literature. Monks studied biblical texts intensely, often memorizing large sections, especially the Psalms. At the same time, they preserved and adapted ancient Latin works, transforming them into tools for Christian teaching and expression. Education played an important role, particularly during the intellectual revival of the 12th and 13th centuries. A small number of monks were sent to study at universities, bringing back new texts and ideas. However, most monks remained within the cloister, where their daily life revolved around two central practices. One was personal spiritual reading and reflection, a disciplined engagement with sacred texts aimed at inner growth. The other was communal worship, a structured cycle of prayers performed throughout the day. Together, these practices defined the core of monastic existence. Even in later centuries, monasteries maintained impressive libraries. Some collections contained thousands of volumes, suggesting a strong culture of reading. Yet, it is unclear how frequently monks engaged deeply with these books. Many were occupied with administrative duties or practical responsibilities, leaving limited time for study. Intellectual curiosity existed, but it was likely concentrated among a smaller group rather than shared equally by all. To better understand this world, it is useful to look at the life of an ordinary monk. One such figure entered a cathedral priory in the early 15th century. He was not an exceptional scholar, but he was diligent and attentive. Upon joining the monastery, he received a list of personal items, including clothing and bedding, for which he was held accountable. His early years were spent under supervision, learning discipline, religious practice, and the expectations of monastic life. After several years, he was ordained as a priest, reaching the minimum age required by church law. Unlike a select few, he was not sent to pursue higher studies. Instead, he remained within the monastery, where he likely combined basic education with practical training. Over time, he began to take on responsibilities, holding a series of minor offices. These roles required reliability and an understanding of both administration and human behavior. Eventually, he was placed in charge of managing agricultural lands belonging to the monastery. This position involved overseeing workers, organizing supplies, and keeping detailed financial records. His notebook, which has survived, offers a rare glimpse into his world. It contains a mixture of practical notes, historical records, personal reflections, and copied texts. Through these fragments, a picture emerges of a man shaped by his environment. He showed an interest in history, recording events within the monastery and beyond. He kept lists of fellow monks, noted visits by important figures, and described ceremonies he witnessed. This instinct to record events reflects a broader monastic habit of preserving memory as part of a larger understanding of history. His reading also reveals something of his inner life. He copied passages from scripture and reflected on their meaning, sometimes attempting to interpret complex theological ideas. He explored questions such as the nature of divine grace and the relationship between human effort and salvation. These were not abstract exercises, but part of a personal effort to deepen understanding. He also showed interest in moral teachings, particularly those emphasizing humility, fear of God, and the need for self-discipline. Silence was another important aspect of monastic culture. From the beginning, monks were taught to control their speech, valuing restraint as a sign of spiritual maturity. Yet this discipline was not always simple. Questions arose about when speaking was necessary, especially in situations where silence might allow error to spread. This tension between silence and responsibility highlights the complexity of monastic life, where ideals often had to be balanced against practical realities. Beyond texts, visual elements also played a role in shaping understanding. Monastic spaces were filled with symbolic imagery, including stained glass windows depicting scenes from Scripture. These images were not merely decorative, but served as teaching tools, illustrating connections between different parts of the Bible. Detailed descriptions of such imagery found in the notebook suggest a keen awareness of their significance. Whether explaining them to visitors or reflecting on them personally, the monk engaged with these visual narratives as part of his spiritual experience. Communication within and beyond the monastery was maintained through letters. These exchanges followed formal conventions, reflecting a learned style of writing. At the same time, they reveal genuine connections between individuals. News travelled through these networks, keeping monks informed about events in distant places, including church councils and political developments. Even within the confines of the cloister, monks remained connected to a wider world. Friendship in this context had a meaning quite different from modern expectations. It was not primarily about private emotional bonds, but was closely tied to social and institutional relationships. Friendship could express loyalty, cooperation, and shared purpose. In many cases, it functioned as a framework for organizing relationships within both religious and political life. Monastic writers explored this concept in depth, often presenting friendship as a path towards spiritual growth. Rather than focusing on individual feelings, monastic friendship was linked to the idea of community. The highest goal was not personal fulfillment, but unity within a shared spiritual journey. Relationships between individuals were valuable, but they were seen as part of a larger structure that aimed toward a common purpose. In this sense, friendship was less about personal attachment and more about mutual support in the pursuit of a higher ideal. This perspective challenges modern assumptions. Today, friendship is often understood as a private and emotional experience, centered on personal connection. In the medieval monastic world, it was embedded within a broader framework of duty, belief, and collective identity. Emotional language was used, sometimes intensely, but it did not necessarily indicate the same kind of personal relationship that it would suggest today. The writings of monks who explored friendship show a consistent emphasis on discipline, selection, and moral responsibility. Not everyone was considered suitable for close friendship, and careful judgment was required. Relationships were expected to support virtue and contribute to the stability of the community. In this way, friendship became another form of structured practice, guided by the same principles that shaped the rest of monastic life. Looking at these elements together, a coherent picture emerges. Monastic culture was not divided between rigid discipline and personal expression, but rather integrated both within a single system. Learning, devotion, work, and relationships all served a common goal. Even individual experiences were interpreted through this shared framework, giving them meaning within the larger structure of the community. The surviving notebook, with its mixture of records and reflections, captures this balance. It does not offer a full biography, but it provides enough detail to show how an ordinary monk lived, thought, and engaged with his world. Through such fragments, it becomes possible to glimpse a culture that was highly organized, deeply reflective, and shaped by a continuous effort to align daily life with spiritual purpose. The medieval world did not possess modern clocks, scientific theories of time, or precise measurements down to fractions of a second. Yet people in that era understood time in ways that are surprisingly familiar. They could distinguish between a moment and a duration, between the exact point when something happens and the length of time it lasts. Days, years, and even centuries were meaningful units, just as they are today. The awareness of life's limited span encouraged reflection, just as it does now. When human life is short, time itself begins to feel vast and complex. From this simple realization, it was only a small step to thinking about the lifespan of humanity as a whole. Time was not just personal, it was cosmic. Daily experience continued to follow the same natural rhythm of light and darkness. The cycle of day and night remained constant, shaped only slightly by artificial lighting. But when it came to shorter intervals, experience depended heavily on how time was filled. This is where monastic life differed most from modern life. Measuring time by the hour, rather than by fractions of a second, was enough for their needs, but it still mattered deeply. Time in the medieval monastic world can be understood through three broad perspectives. The first concerns the longest stretches of time imaginable, stretching from creation to the end of the world. The second relates to the yearly cycle, shaped by religious observance. The third focuses on the division of the day into hours, guiding daily routine. On the largest scale, time was shaped by religious belief. The idea that the world had a beginning was widely accepted. According to prevailing interpretations, the universe had existed for only a few thousand years. Many believed that history itself was approaching its conclusion. The expectation of a final judgment influenced how people understood time as a whole. Life was not seen as an endless progression, but as part of a defined narrative moving toward an end. Scholars studied the creation of the world not just as a story, but as a historical reality. Interpretations of early sacred texts were developed over centuries, blending theology with elements of science. Even without advanced education, ordinary people could grasp the basic message. The world had a beginning, and it would eventually come to an end. This belief shaped everyday thinking and created a constant awareness of time's limits. In monastic settings, history itself was understood as the unfolding of a divine plan. Events were not random, but part of a larger design. This perspective influenced both writing and storytelling. Even simple narratives were framed within a broader vision that stretched from creation to final judgment. Some thinkers attempted to divide history into structured phases, linking human events to symbolic patterns or cosmic cycles. One such approach connected historical change to movements in the heavens. Certain scholars believed that shifts in religious and political power were tied to planetary alignments. These ideas spread widely among educated circles, especially in universities. Time, in this view, was not only sacred but also measurable through the motions of the sky. History itself seemed to follow a rhythm embedded in the universe. While these large-scale concepts were important, daily life was governed by a more practical system. The religious calendar structured the year. It included fixed dates, dedicated to saints, as well as movable feasts that changed according to astronomical calculations. Among these, the timing of Easter was especially significant. Determining its correct date required careful observation of both the sun and the moon. Calendars were not simple lists of dates. They often contained detailed information about celestial movements, including lunar phases and eclipses. This connection between religious practice and astronomy shows how closely timekeeping was tied to the natural world. Celebrating religious events correctly depended on aligning human activity with the rhythms of the heavens. The calendar also carried symbolic meaning. It was not merely a tool for scheduling events, but a way of reenacting sacred history. Each year repeated the story of humanity's fall and redemption. Time, therefore, was experienced as both cyclical and meaningful, constantly returning to key moments while moving toward a final conclusion. Despite this structured system, there were debates about its accuracy. Some scholars argued that the existing calendar had drifted out of alignment with the actual movements of celestial bodies. Efforts were made to correct these discrepancies, though the main concern was not a scientific precision for its own sake. The goal was to ensure that important religious celebrations occurred at the proper time. Beyond the yearly cycle, daily life required an even more detailed division of time. The day was traditionally divided into 24 parts, a system inherited from ancient civilizations. However, these hours were not always equal. In earlier traditions, daytime and nighttime were each divided into 12 parts, meaning that the length of an hour changed with the seasons. Astronomers developed a different system, dividing the full day into equal hours regardless of season. While this approach was more precise, it was not widely adopted at first. Most people, including clergy, continued to use the traditional method, where hours varied in length. This system remained dominant until new technology began to change how time was measured. Monastic life depended heavily on the division of the day into specific periods for prayer. These canonical hours marked key moments from early morning to late evening. Their timing was essential, but not always exact. Various methods were used to estimate time, including observation of the sun, water clocks, and even the repetition of prayers. The major shift came with the development of mechanical clocks. These devices introduced a new level of precision and gradually replaced older methods. Early examples appeared in religious settings, where the need for regular prayer created a strong demand for reliable timekeeping. At first, these clocks did not display time visually, but signaled it with bells. Over time, more advanced designs emerged. Some clocks included complex displays, showing the movement of celestial bodies. These were not only practical tools, but also symbolic representations of the universe. They reflected a belief that time, nature, and divine order were deeply connected. The construction of such devices required both technical skill and intellectual effort. Monastic communities played a key role in this development. Their interest in astronomy and their need for structured timekeeping created an environment where innovation could flourish. Large mechanical clocks became central features in religious buildings, combining function with meaning. By the early 14th century, some of these clocks had reached remarkable levels of sophistication. They could track not only the hours, but also the movements of the sun and moon. In doing so, they brought together practical necessity and a broader vision of the cosmos. In the end, these machines represented more than technological progress. They embodied a way of understanding time that was both spiritual and structured. They marked the hours for prayer, reinforced the rhythm of daily life, and reflected a belief in an ordered universe. Time in the medieval monastic world was not abstract or neutral. It was deeply connected to belief, routine, and the structure of existence itself. From the vast scale of cosmic history to the precise moment of daily prayer, every level of time carried meaning.